Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for our professional development workshop, Supporting Survivors of Domestic Violence in the Workplace. The Chamber is very grateful to provide this offering free of charge to our members because of the generosity of our sponsor, the College of St. Scholastica Stender School of Leadership, Business, and Professional Studies. So before I go ahead and introduce our speaker, I'd like to invite admissions counselor at CSS, Joe Rembowitz, to provide a few remarks on behalf of their sponsorship. So Joe, thanks for braving the snow today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for letting me join you. We're happy to be sponsoring this event and some of the other workshops through the Chamber. So I just like to stop in and say hello and welcome everyone, and of course plug some of the programs that we have going on through the Stender School. So we got starts coming up in the summer and in the fall, and fall seems a long ways out, but it goes quick. So some of the programs that we offer through the Stender School, some of our business or businessy types of programs, depending on your line of work or where you want to get to, we do some health informatics based programs, health information systems. We do a project management certification that is kind of a condensed version of our MS in project management. We also do the MBA in Leadership and Change, which is a program that I've completed. Many people I know have completed it. Kind of a broad degree, but very beneficial, changed my life quite literally. Kind of a rising star program we have is Applied Data Analytics. So we started that a few years ago, and it's becoming increasingly popular just because of the nature of the field. So that program, it's a lot of programming and statistics, which isn't my strength. I'm not good at statistics or the computers, but if you are into that, it's kind of a skill set that's increasing in importance. So I will put a link here to all of our grad programs. Check them out if you get a chance. If you're interested, cool, let me know. I can meet with you. Otherwise, if you can share them with folks, we always appreciate that. As a smaller school, we do as much advertising and stuff as we can, but we do rely pretty heavily on word of mouth and kind of referral-based avenues. So check them out, and like I said, reach out to me if I can help you. Be happy to chat with you. But that's all I've got for today, and thanks again for having me. And I hope everyone has a beneficial workshop here, and have a good rest of your day, okay?
Thanks, Joe. I'm excited to introduce to you now our speaker for today, Jaci Christiansen. Jaci serves as the Community Engagement Coordinator for Safe Haven Shelter and Resource Center, which provides a safe space for women to escape, heal, and rebuild a life that's free of domestic abuse. So as always, we encourage participation to keep the discussion ongoing throughout the hour. So please pop on at any time, audio, video, or chat to ask questions along the way. There will be some additional time at the end for Q&A and some breakout rooms later on. So I'm excited for that. And Jaci, thank you again for being here, and please take it away.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone, on this beautiful Northland day. We've got nice little snowy going on outside my window. So some just basic housekeeping on my end before I get started. I am dual screening it. So if you're like, her eyes are not facing where I think they should be facing, it's just because I'm looking at some notes on the opposite screen. And like Chris said, feel free to use the raise hand feature, take yourself off mute, or just use the chat. I've got that up and visible for myself as well. I'm also right now, just before I forget, I'm going to pop a couple PDFs that we'll look at later. If you have struggles opening that, don't worry. I'll also put in web links when it comes time to using them, but just wanted to throw those in the chat now as well. Yeah, I think that's all I got for now. So let's get started. So today what we're going to cover the basics of domestic violence and kind of get that good base layer for everyone. We'll talk about the impacts in the workplace, and then just that basic supporting survivors and some best practices. And then we're going to end it up kind of doing some breakout rooms and a little bit of case study work. So before we begin too much further, this is kind of my content warning, right? Domestic violence is a really heavy topic. It is not a bunch of sunshine and rainbows for everyone. And so with that, because these types of violence are so prevalent in our society, I always say to always assume that there are survivors among you, right? Even if you may assume that everyone that you're surrounded with in that moment is not directly impacted, just always assume that there are people that are impacted among you. And so with that, of personally, one, being mindful of your reactions. And so today over Zoom, it's a little bit easier, right? Because most of you have your cameras off, right? You're free to react as need be, but just being mindful of your reactions when you're discussing these things in the real life. Also giving yourself grace and taking care of yourself. These are heavy topics, so if you're feeling some feelings, that's okay. And remembering to take care of yourself and respect those around you and their reactions as well. Everybody has a different reaction to these topics. For some folks, that means it's automatic waterworks. I have a coworker who she does really great in the advocacy, but the moment she's talking about it in a presentation, she gets emotional, right? We have some other folks who, in the wise words of Bare Naked Ladies, are the kind of guys who laugh at a funeral, right? And so just being mindful of that. And then also just taking one action of self-care today. I know it's a snowy day outside, so it might not be an outdoor walk, but that this is a kind of a heavy thing. So if you're headed into lunch afterwards, of whether it's a deep breathing or doing some stretching or journaling or coloring or whatever that may be, of taking one self-care action today. So let's talk about kind of just the overall statistics relating to domestic violence. So what we know is that in the state of Minnesota specifically, it's said that 1 in 3 women and gender minorities will experience some sort of violence in their relationships in their lifetime. When we zoom out nationally and look at those statistics, it's 1 in 4 women, usually around 1 in 9 men, and then half of trans and non-binary individuals will experience violence in their relationships. We also know that these types of violence feed on systems of oppression, right? It is a system of oppression. And so with that, we also know that survivors who come from marginalized communities experience higher rates of violence, right? And so, for example, we know that, 1 in 2 trans individuals, but we know specifically Black trans women experience the highest rates of violence. For women of color experience the highest rates of violence. Specifically, women from our Native and Indigenous populations experience violence in the rates as high as like 84%. And so just really taking that time to recognize that somebody who's experiencing already other systems of oppression are more likely to experience domestic violence. The other statistic being that 20 people per minute, so this is across all genders, all demographics, all statistics, right? 20 people per minute are actively experiencing violence from the hands of a partner. And domestic violence is the leading cause in hospitalized injuries in women. And so that exceeds stranger rapes, muggings, and automobile accidents. So we bring these statistics forward just to explain the full large impact of just how many people are experiencing these types of violence. So the definition that we use on our end of things is a much more holistic, broad definition of domestic violence, right? As a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. And this can be using physical violence, emotional, psychological abuse, sexual violence, right? And it can be relationships that are short and new, or it can be relationships that have been around for 40 plus years. The other piece too is that this definition is not what the criminal justice system uses. Domestic violence, the actual criminal definition varies state by state on what is included. But we use this broader definition because we feel that it really more fully encompasses and includes everybody who's experiencing these things. The power and control wheel is probably the most common visual aid that's used when talking about domestic violence. And I'll just go through this briefly today. But this was actually developed here in Duluth in the 80s, looking at kind of why abusers use the behaviors that they do. And part of the reason that we're doing this presentation today with you all about supporting survivors in the workplace is because for so long, domestic violence was seen as just being a home issue, right? And so really domestic violence, the research that came out in like the 80s that really kind of flipped the lens of looking at abuser behaviors versus victim behaviors. Because previously it was looked at as like, what is a victim doing to cause these things happening to them, right? And specifically in that time frame, what are women doing to have their husbands cause harm towards them? And so this research kind of has changed that lens to then looking at like, what are abusers doing to cause harm to their victims, right? What are those behaviors that are being used? And so I'm going to walk through these, but I'm also not going to walk through them in the traditional lens of how we would, but walking through kind of what you might see in a workplace setting. So the first one being intimidation, right? This could be someone showing up unannounced to throw off somebody. This could be a person who you notice that they're kind of tiptoeing around things, or they always need to ask for permission to do things. This could also be maybe you're having a company get together or something where partners are there. And you notice that somebody is giving their partner the mom look, right? We all know the mom look because we've all gotten it at some point in our lifetime, right? That look that tells you what you're doing right now is not okay. But when we're getting that from somebody who is our partner, that's more concerning, right? That isn't a look that we should be getting from that individual. Emotional abuse. This is put downs, name calling. We may see this in somebody who has just a really strong shift, an unexplained shift in their mental health, and their mental well-being. I was at another presentation and a woman stopped by afterwards because she had used her services and just wanted to say thank you. And she had disclosed it was actually her coworker who had noticed and said, "You've never been depressed in the 15 years we've worked together, but you have been so depressed this last 6 months. What's going on?" And there was a new relationship, and that particular individual was experiencing emotional and physical abuse from her partner, right? And so that piece was coming through in that way. Isolation. This could be somebody who suddenly isn't participating in activities in the same way they used to, right? And maybe somebody who isn't going to happy hour anymore. It could be somebody who suddenly has a shift in the way that they dress and they act, or before they do anything, they have to clear it with a partner, right? And not necessarily in a like, let me check the family calendar to make sure nothing's been scheduled, but more of the, I need to make sure this is okay, right? Somebody who maybe refuses or struggles to work with coworkers of the opposite gender, right? Because maybe their partner is jealous easily, right? So those are some signs that we might see. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is when abusers kind of take what they've done and said it's not that big of a deal. It didn't happen that way. It wouldn't have happened this way if you had an XYZ, finding a way to blame their victim. Some of the ways that we see this is a lot of times abusers will do grand gestures to win back favor of their victims, or to kind of further entrap their victims in a cycle. And so some of those ways of that minimizing, denying, and blaming might be somebody who's frequently getting like unexplained bouquets of flower, right? Or a partner who's stopping by to provide gifts. At another presentation, again, as an example somebody gave me is they had a coworker who it was her husband always brought a cheeseburger and a milkshake for lunch. And she was always like, he brings it because we had a bad night last night, with no real like explanation of what that bad night meant. And when it started becoming more of a weekly or a couple times a week, that then the coworkers called in and said, hey, we're concerned about you. What's going on? Using children. And so this is using custody, exchange time. This is using kids as a tool of control. The other important piece to remember when children come into play is that there's a specific form of abuse called post-separation abuse. And so that is, even if the relationship ends, if there is shared custody, if there is any exchange time, that kind of adds to the violence, right? It continues even after the relationship has ended. So that victim might be quote unquote safe from the violence, right? They may be in a safer home, safer location, but still anytime that it comes to exchange period, that violence is still continuing. Using male privilege, this is really relying on a lot of those traditional gender roles, right? I'm the in heterosexual relationships, it's the I'm the man of the house, do as I say. I kind of rule the roost. This could also be somebody who is leading the workforce because their partner has said that they need to be the full provider because they're the man of the house, right? A lot of this also rests in a lot of like traditional religious values as well. Using economic abuse. This is probably the one that will most overlap with workplaces. What we know is that of survivors who experience domestic violence, the most common abuse tactic used is economic abuse. Over 90% of survivors have experienced some sort of economic abuse. And this is preventing somebody from getting a job, taking actions to intentionally get somebody fired from their employment. It could be taking somebody's money. One example that I was given was a woman who had worked in a rural community, and she was the sole breadwinner for the family, and her husband would go on the days that they had checks available and pick up her check for her, right? And everyone at the HR office thought he was so great, such a loving, doting husband, because checks came out on a day that she didn't work, that he came and picked them up. But she actually saw none of that money. Her husband deposited the checks and made use of that himself, right? And so knowing that kind of piece of having limited access to income, or having limited access to how that income's spent, so maybe getting an allowance. Another woman that I spoke to told the story about how she herself had a really good income and had a really good earning, but her credit score was awful because her abuser, her husband, kept opening fraudulent credit cards in her name and maxing them out, right? So kind of that piece again of that economic control. And then coercion and threats. So it's forcing somebody to behave in ways they don't want to, or threatening to hurt them or hurt themselves. So it could be a threatening to commit suicide, threatening self-harm. It could be somebody who at the workplace is all of a sudden behaving in ways, or maybe taking company supplies that doesn't really make sense, because it could be that their abuser is telling them to do that. So why the workplace, right? Why are we focusing on that today? Why are we talking about these things? And one thing that we know is that the workplace may be the only time that a victim is free from their abuser. The workplace may be the only time that a victim truly has the opportunity to talk to somebody privately. It may be the only place that a victim feels safe from violence, right? And so we want to create that environment where employees, clients, whoever it may be that we're working with feels safe to disclose, or at least feels safe to seek out resources within that space or to talk about what they're experiencing. This is why we do trainings with medical providers and hairstylists, because they're also in that same field of like when somebody may be alone, right? When somebody may be free from their abuser. So some of the specific statistics that relate directly to the workplace. So in the US, $8 billion is lost every year in lost productivity and healthcare costs. This is from folks needing to call out sick or not showing up to work because of violence, of people losing work because of injuries related to their violence, of time lost, not just from the victim experiencing things, but maybe other coworkers being distracted about what is going on, and then just overall healthcare costs. And then 44% of full-time employed adults have said that they've personally experienced the effects of domestic violence in the workplace. And this is amongst all of the workforce, right? This isn't just victims. This is all full-time employed adults, is what this research had showed, that 44%. And so that's seeing things that are happening, and whether it's seeing or experiencing things based on their interactions with the person who is the perceived victim, but also of knowing that there's a potential that the abuser, right, is the employee, right? That is the person that we're working with. We may not be necessarily seeing their victim, but we may be seeing the abusive behaviors on behalf of the person who's causing the harm. And 96% of domestic violence victims have said that they've had issues at work because of their domestic violence, whether that's their abuser using their workplace as a tool of control, right? Or just experiencing getting in trouble for absenteeism, of struggling to focus at work, of having coworkers or supervisors or HR departments that kind of continue that victimization by either not taking them seriously or not supporting them. So let's talk about some of the red flags that we might see in the workplace. So the first one, increased absenteeism. Somebody who normally is maybe a diligent worker who's always on time or really great on calling out is all of a sudden absent regularly with not as much of an explanation as to why. Seeing that somebody has the inability to concentrate, maybe they're constantly worried about things that are going on at home, or they just kind of always seem a little bit sidetracked or like something else is going on. Increase in personal calls or visits from the partner. And so somebody who normally keeps the personal calls to a minimum, all of a sudden, either they're getting a ton of calls on their cell phone, or maybe there's calls coming through their work phone from their partner. And then also when that happens, that urgency that comes from this, like, I have to answer this or else, or always transfer them through. And then, I think also because phone calls sometimes are minimal now, but somebody who maybe seems to get really anxious when they're getting texts from their partner, right? That piece of like, I need to look at this now, I need to respond to this now, or else, right? Drastic change in behavior and demeanor, it can also be another sign, especially if you know, if it's a newer relationship or if there's been a shift in the relationship, right? Of having those pieces. Survivors also are going through a lot internally and mentally. And so that's why we oftentimes see increases in appearances of being agitated, feeling angry, feeling like work is much more of like a safety network, or being hypervigilant. Along with the increased absenteeism, red flags always trip me up, because sometimes the red flag can be opposite of each other, right? Because it could also be that somebody feels really safe at work, and so they're working much longer hours, or they're staying at work much later than they normally do. Again, because it's a place they feel safe and comfortable in. Not participating in meetings, Zoom calls, or other office activities. Maybe it's somebody who now frequently has their camera off on Zoom meetings. Maybe it's somebody who, when they're in a meeting, they seem very distant, or they're just not showing up. Maybe it's somebody who used to be like the life of the party at like after work things, and now they don't even show up anymore. And then unexplained injuries or chronic illness, right? Showing up with either obvious bruising, but then also just having injuries that just don't make sense, or the stories don't line up. And we know that survivors have an increase in chronic illness and also an increase of substance use. So just real quick, if anybody wants to throw in the chat, does anybody have any other red flags that they've seen or heard of that they'd be willing to share? Anyone else have any?
Not seeing any pop through.
I'm not seeing anything about. Okay, so if you have anything else that pops up, again, feel free to add it in the chat. I wish that Zoom's chat function was kind of like a text message, that you could see speech bubbles when somebody was typing. But we'll move along here. So the main thing that we tell people is, when you're supporting somebody, of really just remembering these three things of listen, believe, and support. And so we'll go into like some more nitty gritty best practices, but if nothing else, of just remembering these things, three things of listening, believing, and supporting. The first off, of knowing that for survivors of domestic violence, disclosing that that's the situation that they're in is not always easy. right? Even in the year 2023, there's still a lot of stigma that surrounds domestic violence. And there still is a lot of folks who have fear or who have shame that come with identifying as a survivor. So if somebody is opening up and saying that they're experiencing something going on in their relationships, of listening to them, of really giving them space to listen to what they're experiencing. The other piece is believing folks. That is the one thing that we usually hear the most from people is, I told somebody and they didn't believe me. And so that I never told anybody again, right? Or I definitely didn't go back to that source again. The other piece too is, I like to say, like, Duluth is the biggest small town I've ever known. And so chances are you may know their partner, right? You may know that the person that they're experiencing harm from. And it may even be what, that person, I don't think that they'd ever do that. But really believing them in the fact of that is their story, and that is what they're experiencing, and they're sharing that with you. And so believing them with that. And then providing support. And so we'll talk a little bit more of that at the end, but that's why we're here. That's why Safe Haven exists, of providing support out. Some other tools that can be used when kind of coaching yourself through this is, especially depending on what your role is with your organization, is if you have any like confidentiality or privacy standards of things that, you have to report, or you know that you are confidential and they can tell you, of letting somebody know that. The other piece too is sometimes it's uncomfortable to ask somebody to be like, hey, is this what you're experiencing? And so sometimes it might just be hey, I don't know if this is what you're experiencing or not, but I want to let you know that there's resources out there in the community. And so even if you're not interested in them, I just want you to be aware of what's going on, right? And that there's resources in our community to reach out to if you need to. So we are going to actually look at one of those PDFs. I also put a link in the website or for a website that'll pull it up. So if you have a second screen, if you want to look at it, that's great. If not, I've got the titles of each heading up here on the slide, and we'll walk through. So this little worksheet, it's 2 pages. The first side is meant for you to be able to look through your organizational practices. So whether you're somebody in HR and you're looking at things from the full head of things, if you're somebody who supervises, looking at it from your lens, if you're somebody who's working with clients and customers, you can also look at what can we do to provide safety and security to a client or customer who maybe is experiencing violence. So we're going to take a good chunk of time now kind of going through these things. So the first practice is flexible scheduling. And so that's employees can take the time they need to meet with police, attend court, therapy, doctor appointments, find shelter housing, set up a new bank account, etc. There are some policies out there in the state that do require employers to give somebody reasonable time off to attend court or to file a harassment restraining order or an order for protection. And so making sure that employees are just generally aware that they're able to do those things. So that way, if somebody isn't maybe ready to disclose to you as their employer, that they're just aware that is a practice that is in place, that they're able to do that. I just kind of informally, knowing that I was doing this presentation and this workshop, informally talked to a bunch of our advocacy staff and was like, all right, what are things that we see survivors experiencing? And so part of it was, somebody needing to take a few week leave of absence because they were going to have to flee to a shelter, right? They knew that was the first step that they needed to take, was to actually completely flee. And so the option was either fleeing or losing their job and losing their income. And so they chose safety and they lost their job, right? We also have had other survivors who, have had employers who are like, yeah, you take the time that you need, you're going to apply for FMLA, or we were going to take from your sick leave to give you some space to do that. So flexible scheduling. The next one is emergency protocols, right? So employees know what to do if somebody's coming in to the workplace to make threats. And so this could be a great project process, just because in today's society, we have a lot of awareness, right, of what's going on with violence in our communities. But what happens when that person is, the partner of an employee? What if that person is an employee who's dating another employee, right? Or an employee who when their partner comes in is causing those violent claims, right? So kind of having some of those emergency protocols, and having that just in case if it's against another employee, a client, or customer. Healthcare coverage, right? Of employees knowing what they have access to when it comes to mental health care. A lot of survivors, their success on moving forward out of violence, for a lot of them, therapy is the big tool, right? It's that piece of moving from what we call surviving to thriving, right? So they're surviving, maybe I'm out of that relationship, right? But that thriving is I've been able to move on from that relationship, right? I've been able to get access to resources. I've been able to work on my mental health. I've been able to increase my confidence. And so having employees being aware of what resources are available to them for that. A zero tolerance policy. And so that there's a clear, excuse me, that there's a clear policy if the employee is the one causing the harm. So what if it's an employee who you find out is causing harm to their partner, who is also a customer, right? What if it is an employee who is causing harm to their partner? But now you've noticed that, and this is pretty common, that those behaviors of control are also happening within the workplace, right? And how does that happen? What's the plan if maybe there's a customer or client who's causing harm to their partner and it's making the workplace unsafe, right? Is there a policy in place? Is there a strategy in how to handle that? Confidentiality, right? There's a clear and concise privacy policy. We know that individuals are more likely to disclose if they know their privacy will be protected. And so that just in general, as a workplace, that those privacy concerns are being held and taken seriously on all fronts, right? I think, I know for myself, like I've experienced with a previous employer where I might disclose something to my supervisor and then my coworkers asking me about it at lunch, right? I left that place of employment pretty quickly afterwards, right? Of that piece of, well, I thought what I shared with my supervisor personally would be kept confidential. Now I'm finding out about this, right? That same place of employment, I later found out about another coworker's abusive relationship from that supervisor at a happy hour, right? So again, that piece of that there's a confidentiality policy, and that also like supervisors, HR, whoever's management, whoever's supposed to be upholding that, right, is also being kept accountable that they're maintaining the privacy of employees. Doing safety audits, right? To make sure that safety protocols are being upheld, of doing, whether that's a quarterly, we check in about it, or annually we do a walkabout to see what's happening. I know like college campuses do a once a year walk, where like higher up employees will walk a campus in the evening time to see where are dark corners and parking lots where staff or students might be unsafe. So maybe that's at your place of employment. Maybe it's, okay, well, we have folks that are leaving in the dark time, especially, I mean, it gets dark at 5 o'clock in December, right? And so maybe it's doing audits to make sure that parking lots are well lit, that folks are feeling safe, that if somebody's calling, they're not just automatically getting put through, they're getting properly screened. And then trauma and victim centered, right? So the policy is in place to protect the employee, customer, or client if an abuser brings a safety issue into the workplace, and that the victim is involved in the process. All too often we'll hear stories of survivors who their abuser will come to the workplace to antagonize the workplace with an attempt to get the victim fired. And honestly, as an employer, the easier solution is to let that employee go, right? But is there ways to, instead of just letting that employee go, so we don't have to deal with the abuser, are there things that we can do as a workplace to make it safer for that employee, or to just not allow that abuser back on site? And then safety planning. And so HR, or the equivalent staff, has the knowledge on safety planning, on what to do for staff, so that they're safe at home or at work. There's a link to a helpful guide in the PDF. The big thing with safety planning is that guide is like super thorough, and like it's like 9 pages long, and you can print it off. But really what it is it's kind of like fire safety day, right? We do fire safety day every year at elementary schools. And you tell kids to go home and talk with your parents about what to do if there's a fire. And that's really what safety planning is with relationship violence as well, is it's okay, if there's a violent incident, where in your home can you go that's safe? Who can you call? What can you do? And then also trespassing and protection orders. The second page of this PDF, just for your general knowledge, has a whole bunch of local, statewide, and national resources. And they are all hyperlinked as well. So you can click on each of those things and get connected to websites or resources. And so I think most of the agencies that serve the Arrowhead region are included on that PDF.
Hey, Jackie, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you scroll back up on this PDF to the trauma right there, trauma and victim centered? Can you elaborate on what it means the victim has involvement in the process?
Yeah. So part of what that is we want to make sure that we're not making decisions that may cause more harm for somebody. So a victim may say, I'm not in a place to leave this relationship yet, or to leave this home, right? For a lot of survivors, it's kind of, I call it the chicken or the egg. They have to decide, do I want to leave this relationship, or do I want to be homeless, right? Like they almost have to pick which one they'd rather have. And so involving a victim in on that process of, if you're going to trespass their abuser or not from the workplace, right? Or what that may look like, to potentially not cause any further harm.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying that. Does anybody else have any questions on these? And with these resources, like I said, they're all clickable. The reason that I listed the counties is Minnesota has a service provider for each courthouse that specifically is working with survivors of domestic violence in each courthouse. And so that's kind of what that is. For shelter programs serve from all geographical areas.
This is great, thank you. I will share this too with everyone here and those not in attendance, so that you can look back on this PDF thereafter.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chris. So we're going to do some case studies, and I'm actually going to pull this over. I'm going to put another link so you can, I would suggest clicking on this link, because we're going to do some breakout rooms, so that way you still have access to it. But there's 3 different case studies, and when you get to the breakout, you can decide which one would work best for you in your particular situation. So I'll read through them all, and then you can kind of walk through what you might do in your workplace. So the first one is Keely. So Keely is an employee at your company who works from home. Another employee brought concerns forward about client confidentiality when they found out that Keely's partner monitors all of her calls, emails, texts, and social media accounts. Keely will be on site this week to update some of her HR paperwork, and you'll have a chance to be one-on-one with her. So kind of just going through then, what would that conversation with Keely potentially look like? What could you do to support her? And then also a little bit of like, that other employee might want some follow-up, right? Of like, well, what are we doing to make sure that client paperwork is kept confidential? And then there's Lucy. So Lucy used to work at the same company as her ex-husband. Lucy ended up quitting that job because her ex was close with the CEO, and she was afraid that no one would believe her, and she would get labeled as the abuser and fired. Although Lucy has a new job, she still works in the same field as before. She recently disclosed how bad things were with her ex and that he still occasionally stalks her. You realize now that there are professional meetings that require her to interact with her ex, and there's a project they may have to work on together. So how would you solve that? If either you could take it from as her supervisor, maybe you're just her coworker that she's disclosed this to, or maybe you're HR if that's your role. And then the last one is Joey. Joey is a new customer or client. You've noticed that every time you meet with him, he has a different phone. You make a lighthearted comment on how he always has a new phone, assuming that he's clumsy and has broken the past few. He starts to get emotional and says that his partner keeps breaking his phone because they don't want him talking to anyone else. You know his partner. They are a long-standing customer or client in your organization. So that link, there's a link in the chat that you can click on and should bring up a website, web page. I loaded it on our website in the background. So you can still have access to these when you're in the breakout area, because I know that sometimes the screen disappears when you do a breakout. All right, and then Chris is going to put everybody in. So have about 5 minutes to just talk about it with whoever you're with in your group. And then when you're done, you can come back, or you can just wait till the 5 minutes runs out.
Perfect. Thanks, Jackie. I will go and launch those.
All right. Is everyone back in? Perfect. Does anybody want to share what they discussed? I know that we have a small group. You can either take off mute or throw it in the chat.
I don't mind sharing. I worked with Christy and Gail, and we used the Lucy example. So as far as primary concerns for Lucy, we came up with, would this affect her performance on her project? How would she feel about interacting with her ex? And is she feeling safe at work in general? Because it sounds like these two have to work with each other from a distance, if nothing else. And then how would we approach the conversation? Start by asking how Lucy is feeling about it, how Lucy is feeling about working with him, how Lucy is feeling about having to interact on a project. And then reassuring her job is safe either way, and asking, how can we support you? What are some other solutions that we might come up with other than what we have now?
Yeah, that's a huge one. If nothing else, of just saying, like, your job is still safe, right?
Yeah.
All right, 1 second. I just had an update thing. So I'm like, no, I don't want Zoom to shut down. Okay, there we go. That would have been the worst thing ever. Probably not the worst thing, but it would have been not great. So let's share our screen a little bit here. So I want to talk just briefly about our services and kind of what some of those referrals look like in the community. The other piece too is you are all experts in your respective fields at your respective places of employment. And so we don't expect you to, after 45-minute workshop, of now all of a sudden knowing everything about domestic violence and being absolute experts, because that's impossible. And so Safe Haven, our mission is providing safety, space to heal, advocacy, and empowerment for women, children, and all survivors of domestic violence. Our services are gender inclusive to all survivors, and regardless of whatever type of relationship that they are coming out of as well. So we've been around in the community in the Twin Ports for 45 years today, actually. And so most people who've been around in the community for a long time know us as the Women's Coalition. That's what we originally were, but we're now Safe Haven Shelter and Resource Center. We're not the only resource in the community either. CASDA is our neighbors over in Superior. Dabanugan is another small shelter that also does some legal advocacy that's housed out of ACO. Fond du Lac has their own domestic violence advocate line as well as some national resources I wanted to put in. So Workplaces Respond is a website that is specifically geared towards employers and workplaces. So they have resources that are specifically for HR, specifically for supervision. And then they also have a chat function as well. So if you have really specific, like, how do I manage this in an HR function, they have a website that you can interact with to get some support. United Way 211. I know that a lot of companies in our community are also supporters of United Way. And 211 is their kind of human services crisis line, which we are connected through as well. So if maybe an employee doesn't feel safe taking resources home specifically about domestic violence, maybe they take a card home about 211 and just say it had to do with United Way campaign at work. When reality is that's an easier number to remember than 218-728-6481, right? That they can call and get some resource. And then law enforcement as well. Services that we provide that also reflect these other local agencies provide the same things. Legal advocacy, so providing support with orders for protection, harassment, restraining orders. People can do those on their own, but they're really difficult paperwork. And they take time and they're not trauma informed. And so instead they can have an advocate fill that out with them. So they're not having to do that process alone. Sometimes that requires attending a court hearing and again, having somebody do that with them so they don't have to be alone. We also provide shelter. Our shelter is again open to survivors of all gender identities. We provide all basic needs when somebody comes into shelter, including meals, getting connected with community resources. Kind of that piece of we want survivors to feel further connected to the community when they leave shelter. So that way they're not just reliant on safe haven services, but they also know what other service providers are out there. Because what we know is that it takes 8 to 10 times for somebody to successfully leave a relationship. And so that way, if somebody needs services and it's not safe to use the domestic violence services, they maybe can use the Damiano or Chum or whatever else it may be. Specifically at Safe Haven, we also do youth support as well. And so we provide support to the whole family. So if we're maybe working with the parent and there's some kids at home, we have a couple youth advocates that'll do fun activities with kiddos. Some parents use it for respite childcare, right? So it's like an hour or two a week that they hang out with youth advocates. For some others, that's when they have their therapy appointment. So they maybe drop their kids off to hang out with an adult that they know is going to be supportive and caring while they go do their own self-care. So there is our contact information and our locations. Does anybody have any questions?
This was fabulous. Thank you. We can wait a few more minutes, of course. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to pop on audio or in the chat, and we're happy to answer them while we have Jaci here.
I have a question. So this is super helpful for like in the workplace with my team members. I'm in financial services and I'm just wondering, like, one of the indicators of DV could be related to finance. And just I've seen those things in my career. I've seen those things on customers' accounts or members' accounts. And just, you know, it seems like I've come across some situations where at the time I didn't really know about these resources, or I didn't know what it could be helping people in our community with. And so I guess my question is, how can I support my membership? Or, you know, is there a way to get some information other than where to go to them if I happen to have that kind of trust with them, which I often do in my work, where I can offer that.
Yeah. So a couple other things, if you want to, you can, my email is up here. You can reach out directly to me and I can get you like some of our brochures. And so you can have those resources available. We have just generic, like this is what Safe Haven is. And we actually have one that's specifically about safety planning. And so being able to walk through with somebody of like what to do to be safe. The other piece too is, especially if you have that relationship of helping them ask how you can be a part of their safety plan. And so maybe that's is there a way that we can make some things, an account that maybe it doesn't have access by your abuser, right? Is there, if you call, especially if you're doing mostly like over phone or virtual, like, is there a way that we can have a code word to know that it's safe to talk about it at that time? Or it's not, because there's actually somebody sitting off screen that I can't see right now. Or there's somebody on the other end of the line that I don't know about. So that's another key thing too, is sometimes just asking somebody to be like, how can I be a part of your safety plan to support you with that? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there have been instances where, and it's not just domestic, but we've had like elder abuse situations too. And it's like that other person's always the abuser's there,
Yeah.
and how do you get that person away?
Yeah. And I'm going to tell you the same thing that I tell medical staff of like, because we're always like, you want to be alone when you talk to somebody. And so my thing is like, figure out which little white lie sits well in your ethics system.
Yeah. We've done that. Yeah, definitely.
So it's like, oh, this computer is not working. I just need you to come here to sign one thing for 2 seconds. You can just stay here and wait. We'll get you some water while you wait, right? Whatever that may be. So kind of figuring out what little thing that you can do to get that person alone. And sometimes it is when you do have them alone to then be able to have that code word, right? If they're in good mental standing to remember that, to know like, and maybe it's just, that's how they signal to you that they're feeling safe or not. Right. And maybe if they signal to you that they're not feeling safe, that's you have already discussed that you're calling law enforcement in. Right. So kind of whatever that may be.
Thanks.
Yeah, Christy asked about free legal support. We do have a partnership with Legal Aid, so we'll have Legal Aid come on site about once a month to do clinics, as well as we have a couple of their kiosks as well.
Perfect. Well, we're right at noon, so I think we're going to go ahead and close it out. I will be sending the recording and all of these resources and Jaci's information to everyone here, and then everyone who was not able to attend. So if you do have further questions or would like to reach out, Jaci will be available to do so. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Jaci, this was wonderful and so thoughtful. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And
yes, thank you.
I hope you have a nice day, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone. Stay warm.
You too.